Good evening, gentlemen. We are holding in the middle of chapter 7 of the second part of Tanya. We are going to be reading today starting on page 917 in the English. I'm going to be reading from page 917 in the English. If you turn past the pages of Hebrew at the beginning, you'll get to the English pages. Page 917 in the English. We are in the middle of a discussion. We've gone far afield in the past couple of weeks. We've been trying to understand from every angle and multiple different ways. We've been working hard to understand a very complex topic, which is the idea of Yehuda Ilah and Yehuda Tata, the higher level unity and the lower level unity of God. As we've been explaining, Yehuda Ilah, the higher level unity, is experienced like a miracle that is above nature. What is revealed in the experience of Yehuda Ilah is that time and space only exist to reveal God. They only are present. All that really is here is a revelation of God. Time and space do not have any independent importance or any independent reality to themselves whatsoever. This was what was felt in the Beis HaMikdash, right, in the place of the Aron, the miracle that took place in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, in the Holy of Holies. Yehuda Tata, on the other hand, the lower level unity, is the experience of the lower level unity is like a miracle that's invested within nature, right? We said, for example, like the Purim story or the victory of the Maccabees in the story of Hanukkah, where the victory and the miracle comes in a way that it's totally invested within nature. In other words, what do you feel is taking place? Nature. And yet what is taking place? Something that is above nature, clearly the express will of God. So what we really concluded, that was a very, very short summary of the past couple of weeks of classes, what we really concluded is that either way, Malchus, the divine trait of kingship, God's desire to be king over the universe, his trait with which he rules over the universe that is separate from him, known in Hebrew as Malchus, God's Malchus is, from his perspective, totally non-important and non-existent, like the ray of the sun in the sun, right? It has no independent reality of its own whatsoever. And because Malchus is the source of the worlds and is the place in godliness from which the world, as we experience it, derives, in other words, the world as a separate reality from God, therefore, the separate reality from God is not separate from him at all, even in its source. There is nothing other than God. Even the place in godliness, the eternal divine trait, which, so to speak, makes room for a world, right, which allows for there to be a separate reality from him, even that place in godliness is itself totally united with him. It has no separation from God whatsoever. So from his perspective, there is nothing other than him and everything is of no consequence. From the perspective of the creation, from the perspective of the Tachtonim, from the perspective of his kingship, there's really two ways of looking at it, which are the higher level unity and the lower level unity. Either his kingship is united with what's higher than it, or what's higher than his kingship is united with his kingship, which expresses, as I said, in different ways, as a miracle above nature or a miracle invested within nature. But either way, in other words, we're not going to be talking about Yehuda Ilah, Yehuda Tata this week. So what's the summary? That either way, what is this perspective itself? This perspective itself is totally united with God. God's kingship is totally and completely one with him. Therefore, in chapters 1 through 6 of the Tanya, we explained that the world is absolutely nothing in comparison to its source. All that exists is the source of the world. And here in chapter 7, we have explained that because of Yehuda Ilah and Yehuda Tata, there's two different ways to explain it, but the source of the world itself is also absolutely nothing and totally one with God. So the world is absolutely one with God and has no independent reality. The source of the world, in a different way, has absolutely no independent reality. And therefore, the world is absolutely one with God. Ein od milvado. The only thing that exists is God, nothing other than Him, and nothing exists independent of Him. And this is what we say in Kriyas Shema. Every day, we say Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, which is a statement of the higher unity, Yichud Ilah, and we say Baruch Shem Kavod Malchusay Leilam Vod, and that is the statement of the lower level unity. That is the summary of the past few classes. Today we are going to move on. We're going to build on this understanding. Given the fact that God's kingship is totally and completely united with Him, it has no independent reality of its own whatsoever. Therefore, we are going to learn more about God's relationship with the universe based on this understanding. So we are going to start reading on page 917. Vehine, now, halfway down the page. Vehine, now, b'masha nisboyer. From what we have explained, Yuvan Mashakasov, we understand what the verse says. It's in Malachi, from the prophet Malachi, Ani Havaya Loi Shanisi, which means, I, God, have not changed. Now, there is a literal reading of the verse. We are giving the Chassidic reading of the verse. We are giving the deeper, in the Pnimius HaTorah, the inner meaning of this verse. When the verse says, I, God, have not changed, and there's an end to the verse which maybe we'll talk about later, but when the verse says, I, God, have not changed, Chassidus understands this 100% literally. In other words, when God as He exists before He creates the world, and God as He exists after He creates the world, is exactly the same God. There is no change from God's perspective whatsoever in the creation of the world. The creation of the entire universe and all of the spiritual worlds, from God's perspective, does not constitute a change. Nothing has changed. That is what we mean by the verse, Ani Havaya Lo Shanisi. I, God, have not changed. Now, why did we not say this earlier in the Tanya? Because His trait of Malchus, His trait of kingship, which is really the topic of chapter 7 that we're discussing now, that we've just finished discussing, would be the contradiction to this principle. You say, I, God, have not changed, and yet God Himself has a trait, kingship, right, also known as speech, right? We've discussed how Malchus is also speech. He has a trait which is inherently geared towards something other than Himself. In other words, it's like what do they call it? I think they call it Chekhov's gun or Chekhov's rifle. Have you ever heard of this principle? There's a principle in playwriting that apparently comes from Anton Chekhov, the famous Russian playwright, that if there is a gun that hangs in the first scene of the play, hanging above the fireplace, at some point in the play, someone will shoot the gun, right? So that's Chekhov's gun. So you have in God Lahavdil, you have a similar idea. I'm looking at God, so to speak, before He creates anything. And I see that He has a trait of Malchus. He has a trait which is meant to be His, to allow Him to relate to something other than Himself. Doesn't that imply that therefore there must be a universe? At some point in this story, something is going to be created. And what we've just explained at the level of Yichud Ilah and the level of Yichud Tata, whether you want to explain it with the higher level unity or the lower level unity, there's two different ways to explain this idea. Either way, it is not a Chekhov's gun. Malchus, His kingship, His ability to relate to something other than Himself, is of itself of no importance. It itself has no true reality to it. His traits, His spheros, the 10 divine traits of which kingship is one, the divine trait of relating to something other than Himself, is totally and completely united with Him. It has no independent reality. In other words, there is only God Himself. There is no trait to relate to others. The trait to rule over others is kaloi chashiv. It itself is of no consequence and of no importance to God. Therefore, if you look at God before the creation, there is absolutely no need to make a creation. And if you look at God after the creation, there is not even a creation here. It's the same. Nothing has been actualized. Nothing that needed to happen has happened. Nothing of consequence has taken place, right? It's like the equation we're describing is God plus 0 equals God, right? What we've basically come to conclude at this point in chapter 7 is that not only the physical universe and all of the creation as described in the 6 days of creation, but even his own divine traits, including his trait of kingship, all of these things amount to 0. All of these things from God's perspective are not, number one, non-existent, separate from him, and number two, of no consequence. There is nothing that is added. There is nothing that is added in the creation of the world, right? Not implicitly before it's created, and not in reality after it's created. Neither way is there anything additional to God. That is the Alter Rebbe's reading of the verse, Ani havaya lo shanisi. I, God, have not changed. As he goes on to explain. Pirush. Meaning, bottom of page 917. She'ein shum shinui klal. There is no change to him whatsoever. Kamei shahaya levade kedem brias ha'elam. Just as he was alone before he created the universe. Kach hu levade achar shenivra. So too is he alone after it has been created. The creation made him no less alone. Right? There's nothing has been added to his singular existence. Right? There's nothing has been achieved. Is actually one way of putting it. Right? What has been achieved by the creation of the universe? The answer is nothing. If the universe had achieved something, right, that would mean that there's some potential for a universe or some need for a universe that pre-existed the universe that has now been fulfilled, right? That would be if Malchus had its own independent reality. His need to speak or his need to be a king was itself real like he is, right? Then you could say that the universe fulfills some sort of end. The universe fulfills something in God. It fulfills a need of God, right? He needs to be a king. He makes a universe, and now his need is fulfilled, right? As we have just finished explaining, this need is also non-existent to God. From his perspective, this need is not real. It's not an additional reality to him himself. He doesn't need it at all. Therefore, the universe is not fulfilling a need and is to no end. It fulfills no need in God whatsoever. Therefore, God himself has not changed. The universe adds nothing to this entire equation. Neither in existence nor in importance, as we've explained. This is what the verse says. Atahu ad shalei nivra elam, atahu misha nivra elam. Not the verse, pardon me, I believe it's from the Siddur. Yeah, it's based on...
middle page 2,
not just Pasach Eliyahu, we say it before Shacharis as well. But I'm not sure if it's in Pasach Eliyahu, but we definitely say it before Shacharis.
You're right.
I think it's based on a Midrash. I think it's based on a Tanya of Eliyahu. It says here Yalkut, which Yalkut is not descriptive because the Yalkut is just a collection of Midrashim, so you're not sure where it originally comes from, but it's in the Yalkut. Fine, so it's a Midrash. The language is I think Yalkut. If I'm not mistaken. The Atahu ad shalei nivra elam, atu misha nivra elam. You are, translation, right? You were the same before the world was created, and you are the same after the world is created, right? Same idea. God is unchanged, right? Now there's a lower way of reading this, I should explain to you, right? In other words, we are jumping right to the Chassidic reading. There's many different ways to read these statements. In other words, when the Alter Rebbe reads it this way, it's actually a chidush, it's an innovation. The Alter Rebbe is reading the verse in the most radical, in a sense, the most literal, but in the most radical way that it's possible to read them, right? Because even without Chassidus, even without anything about Malchus, right? Even if you were dealing with a very basic common sense understanding, you could say that God himself never changes, even though the universe does change, right? In other words, there's God. He brings the universe into existence in some way that I don't understand, right? And now the universe is here, and though the universe changes, he's not changed by there being a universe, right? Why would he be changed? He stays the same. It's the universe that moves, right? In other words, you could explain that. You could explain that in various ways. There's different means you could get to that conclusion. That's not what the Alter Rebbe is saying. The Alter Rebbe is not saying that the universe changes and he remains the same. The Alter Rebbe is saying it in the most radical sense, that he is exactly as he was before the universe is created. In other words, the act of creating the universe itself is not an act. It's a non-act, right? He's saying something totally different. Not that the act doesn't change him at essence, right? You could say, a person's a terrible example because everything a person does changes them in a very subtle way, one way or another. But you could say, in some sense, there's some actions that I do that don't change me, right? There's something that I do automatically. The fact that I move this cup from here to there, right? Although I have to move my arm, fine. But God isn't limited to having an arm, so it's not an issue for him. You could say that it doesn't change me. It doesn't change me, right? It's changed something, but the point is that there's this essential change that's not inherent in me. You could read the verses and the siddur in that way. You could say he's not really changed. He did something, but it didn't change him. He's consistent. You could say it means he's true. There's all sorts of things you could say as interpretations of these things. The Alter Rebbe is saying that all of the motions and the entire act of creation of the universe is really a non-act. That's what he's saying. As God is engaged in creating the universe, so too he is before he is engaged in creating the universe. It's exactly the same. The act of creating the universe, in other words, is not an act in any understanding of the word, in truth. The creation of the universe is a non-act. The whole thing adds nothing and changes nothing from his perspective. Let's go further. We'll get more clarification of this idea. Bli shum shinui. He says, without any change, ba'atzmusai, to he himself. And now the Alter Rebbe adds a second point, v'loi bedaitei, also not to his knowledge. We are now going to turn to this idea, right? We are now going to talk about the divine knowledge. A lot of what we say may sound familiar to you, to those who are longtime attendees of the class, because we spoke about this in our classes on Hamanas Elokus, and the previous thing we were learning quite extensively about the divine knowledge, right? And how God's knowledge doesn't change him. So the Alter Rebbe just adds here, and then he's going to turn to this topic. He says, there's no change to he himself, nor is there any change to his knowledge. And this is actually going to be a very important point. Because, why is the fact that there's no change to his knowledge significant? Because there being no change to him in his very essence, he himself is one thing, right? He's God. Who knows what he's capable of, right? His knowledge is a much more interesting category to say that nothing changes, right? Because his knowledge, first of all, is intimately involved in the creation. He knows everything that takes place, right? Even things that apparently are changing. He knows the universe before he creates it, and he knows it after he creates it. It's a place where it should seem there's a difference. But as we are going to see, where do we really see the depth of what we've said in this chapter? That God's kingship, the divine traits, are themselves as nothing? We're going to see it in the divine knowledge, because as we will see, knowledge is another trait like Malchus, is another trait like kingship. In other words, it's all going to come together quite beautifully. Just as his kingship is nothing additional to him, so too his knowledge is not additional to him. And therefore, his knowledge of his kingship doesn't change. The knowledge changes nothing. Just as his kingship changes nothing, so too his knowledge changes nothing. His knowledge and his kingship have the same relationship to him, which is that they are totally incommensurate to God. And therefore, his knowledge of the universe, which is his knowledge of his kingship, right, changes nothing. So in other words, we really see the point that God is not changed in his knowledge more than in his very essence, than in his very self. In his very self, perhaps his very self is totally non-involved or non-invested. His knowledge, on the other hand, he knows everything. Therefore, to say that his knowledge is not unity with him, to say that his knowledge is separate from him in some way, would be the much more logical conclusion. Rather, the Alter Rebbe here is going to explain how his knowledge is absolutely one with him, and we will see from this that he absolutely does not change. So him not changing and his knowledge not changing are really the 2 points we're making here. And the knowledge is the main one because the knowledge is the main chidush. The knowledge is the main innovation. It's the new thing that the Alter Rebbe is adding, in truth, as I just explained to you. So maybe this will become clearer with some examples.
What do you think would not be clear based on what you just said?
What do you mean?
It's a counter question. It's a question. In other words, I think what you described is that there's a level of immutableness.
Yeah.
That knowledge or not, in other words, what we would consider as knowledge, new knowledge, does not in any way change God in any way.
Yes, that's exactly what we're saying.
So
right. But how can that be, right, is the question.
Well, no, that's the whole...
That's the part we don't understand, is how can that be? What does that mean, right?
No, I mean, that's what we would grapple with.
That's what we're going to grapple with very shortly.
Okay.
So so let's think about, you have two states, right, as we would say as an engineer would say maybe. You have two states. You have God and what he knows before the universe is created, before the 6 days of creation, as described at the beginning of the book of Genesis and the Holy Bible. And you have God and what he knows after the creation. There's also during, which is very interesting. You can use during instead of after if it's more entertaining. It makes it more make it more interesting maybe. But you have God and what he knows before the universe is created, and you have God and what he knows either during the act of creation, which you would be justified in saying because it's an ongoing act, as we've discussed previously in this class, or after he creates the universe. Either or, right? So you have him before he creates the universe, or him during/after he creates the universe, right?
Wouldn't all of this suggest that the creation of the universe was at the beginning, has always been? The universe has always been?
Why?
Because if Hashem is immutable and has never changed, then theoretically this universe has always existed.
So one second. Good question. That's a good question. In other words, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but in other words, you're saying that because God knows the universe and God's knowledge is immutable, therefore the universe is eternal, right? Which is, of course, contradictory to the basis of the entire Jewish faith. So that's not good, not a good conclusion, right? So that is part of that is part of what we're going to explain. So just 1 second. Let's build to there, more simple to more complicated. So
Go very slowly.
You have God and what he knows before the universe is created. You have God and what he knows after the universe is created. Now, one simple answer, right? Let's get what we'd call derisively in yeshiva, we would call the balabatisha answer, right? Let's get the homeowner's answer out of the way, right? There's a simple way you can answer this whole issue, that his knowledge doesn't change, which is that God exists outside of time. Right, in other words, which we've discussed in this class before as a notion, right? In other words, God sees all of time at once, right? He stands outside of time and experiences it all at the same time, just as he stands outside of space and he experiences all of space at the same time. So in other words, God knows everything that will be in the future, so to speak, when he creates the universe, setting aside the issue of the creation of time for the moment. That will totally mess up everything, so leave that aside for a moment. And you have his knowledge of the universe once he creates it. And because God stands outside of time, you could say, these are the same knowledge. In other words, I know what I'm going to do, right? The classic Chassidic example of someone doing something is building a house, right? I have the idea in my mind of building a house, and then I have actually carrying out my plan and doing it. Now to God experiences both of these things simultaneously. In other words, the the future universe that will be created, again, allowing for the idea of time, because without it we can barely speak and form sentences, with the future universe that will be created, and the universe that he has created, to him, he sees them from outside of time, so it's the same, right? To him, it's all equal. So he knows the future in the exact same way that he knows the present or the past, right?
That means it's static.
Something similar to that is really the issue with the something along those lines is really the issue with this explanation. The issue with this explanation is that just because God experiences it outside of time and all at once doesn't mean that the before the universe is created and the after the universe is created are the same thing, right? If you think about it. In other words, actually creating the universe is a different knowledge perspective on it than knowing everything that will happen in it before it is created, right? In other words, this is no escape at all. What does God know? God knows his perspective on the universe from before, during, and after it's created, right? Think about it. He knows it all simultaneously, but that doesn't help us because he has three different knowledges. He has the knowledge of the universe before he creates it, the knowledge as he is creating it. As someone who builds a house knows, it's different to know the house as what I will do, or to know the process of building it as what I will do, and to know it as I am doing it. Right? To know what I will do and to experience the action is actually two different knowledges. So how can you say that all of this is really one unchanging knowledge? You follow? It's not an escape from the question. Our question still stands, which is, how can it be that the creation of the universe doesn't change God's knowledge? There is one knowledge before it is created, so to speak, a perspective from before it is created, and there's a perspective from during and after it's created. Two different knowledges. It's knowing the universe in two different ways. So standing outside of time is of no help whatsoever. There's still two knowledges. Right? And if God never builds the universe, then that knowledge will not be directly experienced. It will only be known as something that would have been. Right? He would only know the act of creating the universe as something that could have been or would have been, but not something that is actually done. Right? Obviously, this is an oversimplification. We could spend probably 5 classes just on this because really it's all paradoxical because we're talking about God outside of time. In time terms, really a lot of this is not really accurate and how it would be. But I just wanted to point out to you that this basic answer is not what the Alter Rebbe is saying here. The Alter Rebbe is not saying God's knowledge doesn't change because he stands outside of time and experiences everything at once. Right? Because the truth is that there is still a different knowledge of knowing you will do something and actually doing something. It's a different knowledge. So in other words, I'm explaining it poorly, but it creates a recursion of sorts. In other words, it creates a loop. He knows the universe as something that he will do and as something that he does. Then he chooses not to do it. So then he has a knowledge of the universe as he might do it, right? As he would have done it if he had done it, right? Now he has this knowledge. And if he has a knowledge of that, then he has a knowledge of that. And it keeps building on itself. But the point is that you never resolve the problem of there being multiple perspectives and multiple ways of knowledge.
So you're describing as the finance equivalent of the present discounted value of ex ante and ex post.
If that was that in English, even I don't even.
No, this is wrong. Very bad analogy.
I don't know what that means. But
bad analogy.
okay, we have our various opinions. It's just like now it's like a Talmud class. We have varying opinions from the estimable rabbis. I'll need Rashi and Tosfos to explain this to me.
Both applicable at the same time.
What the Alter Rebbe is explaining is something different. The Alter Rebbe is saying that God's knowledge of the universe doesn't change because God doesn't change. Different idea. Not God's knowledge of the universe doesn't change because he sees it all in one instant from a perspective outside of time. God's knowledge of the universe doesn't change because he himself does not change. What does that mean? Well, let us read the last line of 9:18. Why is this the case? Why does his knowledge not change because he doesn't change? The answer is, Ki b'yedias atzmai, because by knowing himself, Yodeya kol hanivroim, he knows all of the creations, Shehakol mimenu, because all of them come from him, which is not itself the point here. The main point is, ubatal b'metzias etzloi, and they are totally nullified to him. Right? What's our example of batal b'metzias, of being totally nullified in existence, that we use again and again in our class? They are like a ray of the sun in the sun. Right? Why is it that God's knowledge of the universe doesn't change? Because number one, he knows the universe by knowing himself. And number two, what is the universe? The universe is to him like a ray of the sun in the sun. It is absolutely and totally nothing within him, included within his existence, as we have been saying, as we have explained over the course of 6.5 chapters. Therefore, his knowledge of the universe does not change, because his knowledge of the universe is really not like a prophet or a fortune teller who sees everything from a perspective outside of time, say, right? That's not what the Alter Rebbe's answer is. The answer is not because he sees everything as it is, but from a perspective outside of time. It's because what is he really seeing? What does he really know? He only knows himself, and he does not change. So because he does not change, his knowledge of the universe does not change. To put it in different words, his knowledge of the universe is really a knowledge of himself.
What is your definition of change? When you say he doesn't change.
We're saying that before the universe is created, and once the universe has created, this makes no change in he himself whatsoever. The universe amounts to nothing. Now that's true. That's easier to understand when it's talking about God himself, because it's hard to even know what the limits are or how properly to talk about God himself. Perhaps he himself doesn't change. He creates in a way that it doesn't change him. But we're saying here that even his knowledge of the universe, in other words, not just he himself, but his relationship with the universe, which is his knowledge, his relationship with the universe is the same before and after it's created. It's the same.
But that doesn't mean that the universe is not dynamic.
No. The universe is dynamic. One second. We'll get to that very shortly. So,
Use the word dynamic. That's dynamic.
One second. Let me see here.
Dynamic.
His knowledge of the universe, right? His relationship with the universe is the same before and after he creates it. A different way of putting this, a very nice way that Rabbi Yoel puts it to really clarify the idea, right? We said before in our review at the beginning of this class that the universe in no way exists separate from him and is of no consequence, right? That's the conclusion of 7.5 chapters. The universe does not exist apart from him in any way. It has no separate metaphysical existence from him. And also, in addition, because even its source is of no consequence, the universe also doesn't matter. He's not compelled to. He doesn't have to make a universe. He's not defined by the universe in any way, right? That's the conclusion of 6.5 chapters of Tanya. If that is the case, if the universe is of no consequence and of no metaphysical existence, then how can the universe cause his knowledge? How can the universe cause his knowledge? When I see this cup, physical object's actually a bad example. When I learned in school, 2 + 2 = 4, right? I learned that in school. So it was encountering this idea, physical objects makes everything fuzzy. It's not good examples in this, in knowledge, because our understanding of knowledge nowadays is totally different than what the Alter Rebbe means by knowledge. Maybe we'll talk about that at different times. That's a whole thing. So that's just a side note. Let's talk about ideas. When I learned 2 + 2 = 4, in school, when each of us learned 2 + 2 = 4 for the first time as little kids, right? We are encountering a truth, and that truth is what causes our knowledge of that truth, right? In other words, In other words, there's something outside of us which is causing a change in our faculty of knowledge. I have a mind. My mind has encountered something new. And I've learned something, right? My mind changes. My mind grows. I now have something else to add to my mind, right? And why has my mind changed? This new thing that I've encountered has caused a change in my mind. I absorbed it, right? It's actually the technically speaking, the form of the thing that's understood is reproduced in my mind, as you would understand if you go and learn again from the first part of Tanya, chapter 5, where he talks about learning Torah and why the unity of the Torah with the person is the greatest unity in the world. Because when you learn something, it becomes absolutely one with your mind that learns it. Your mind and the thing that you've learned are totally inseparable. But from the inside and from the outside, chapter 5 of the first part of Tanya is where you can learn more about this idea.
And now just to the day before you could speak, the day after you could speak.
That you've learned something new. Sure. So the thing that has been encountered, the thing that is known, has added to my knowledge and my knowledge changed, right? What we are saying is that since the universe has no metaphysical existence, it's not a thing separate from him and additional to God, right? We're talking about from God's perspective, of course. From our perspective, it doesn't bear talking about. It's pathetic. We learn new things all the time. From God's perspective, right? The question is not does something in the universe add to a human knowledge, because a human knowledge is not what the universe is created from, right? We're looking at it from the opposite perspective. We start with God's knowledge, right? And then the universe is created. You have God who exists before anything is created, and he has knowledge, right? And he creates a universe, an act which we put scare quotes around, because we know that the act of creating the universe is a very, very, very subtle act which changes essentially nothing, especially from his perspective, right? As we learned in 6.5 chapters of Tanya. So, since the thing that is created has no metaphysical reality, it's not, from his perspective, it's not a 2 + 2 = 4, which exists as a concept to be learned, right? It's not a physical object. All of these things are like a ray of the sun in the sun. Therefore, and even the source of all of these creations, of all of these of the universe, is itself of no consequence, as we learned at the beginning of chapter 7. Therefore, when God encounters the universe, so to speak, to learn something new, the universe has no causative power to add to God's knowledge whatsoever. There is nothing here to cause him to learn a new thing, because the entire universe is subsumed within God and his knowledge that existed before it created. It's like saying the sun learns something new by encountering a ray of the sun, right, so to speak. Doesn't make sense, because the sun, encountering a ray within it, pardon me, right, which, as we explained at great length in chapter 3, it may not be clear to the people who haven't been in the class since then, but the ray of the sun in the sun means that really all that's here is the sun. There are no actual rays of light within the body of the sun. All that is really here is the sun, right? The ray exists only as a potential for a ray, right? Or the early existence of the ray before it leaves the sun, yet it must be in the sun because the sun is its only source. You can go back and listen to all the classes on chapter 3 where we had this whole discussion. So when the universe exists as a non-entity, and all that is really here is God, how can knowing something in the universe have any power to change God's knowledge? It has no causative power because it doesn't exist separate from the knowledge that already was there.
The knowledge of humans from the outside in.
Yes.
The knowledge of God is from the in and out.
Yes, very good way of putting it. Yes, exactly.
Therefore, he is the one who manufactures knowledge.
Yes, exactly. So he is already perfect. He already has all the knowledge. In other words, in a way, the universe itself is really just a finite subset of his infinite knowledge, is one way of putting it, right? So what can that add to the knowledge? The answer is nothing, right? Because it's already known. But the thing is that this only works under the principle of what the Alter Rebbe said. Let me read the words again. Ubatel b'metzias etzloi, that it is lacking any existence within him. right? Because if what he thought and what he learned about the universe achieved some importance or some metaphysical reality of itself, of its own, this would not hold true, right? Because something would have changed. Before there would have been a potential for a universe, or he would know what would be in the future, and then the thing would actually be created. So there would be a slightly different knowledge, even though he would have already known everything that would happen, of course, etc., etc. Still there would be something changing. There's something that wasn't here, and now there's a thing which is here. It's true, that thing may be smaller or lesser or a finite part of his knowledge, but it's here at least. So he knows it as something that exists, rather than what it was before, which is that it didn't exist before he created the universe. Here, what we're saying, based on 6.5 chapters of Tanya, the chidush is, the innovation is, that the act of creating is not really an act. It's a non-act. There is nothing that is being done here whatsoever. Therefore, when he knows what he has created, this adds nothing to his knowledge. Not just on technicality, because he already knows everything, etc., but because the very act of creation is a non-act. All that is really here, in a sense, is his knowledge. There is no creation apart from it, right? As he will explain more. Let me get to another point here.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So if we say that God is a dynamic entity,
Yeah.
my other question is, if he's a dynamic entity,
Yeah.
does God, is it a constant process of manufacturing new knowledge?
Yeah. We're not really saying that God is dynamic. That's not what we're saying. We're not saying God is dynamic. We're saying something a little more subtle, something a little more abstract. We're saying that his dynamism, right? His dynamism, his act of constantly creating a changing universe is, from his perspective, static. That's what we're saying. We're not saying God is dynamic.
How do we know that? How do we know that he doesn't manufacture something new?
No, because the way he creates is that everything is totally batul b'metzias to him.
Right.
Everything is totally lacking in existence. So what he is changing is not really a change. It's a change only from the perspective of the thing that is created, as we've been explained, but not from his perspective. So he's not dynamic in a sense. It depends how you look at it, right? But he's not dynamic. From his perspective, he just is. And everything that happens within time and everything that is changing is just part of him being and his eternal, his Ein Sof, his infinite light. Nothing is actually changed. Let me give for a moment, let me give a hands-on example, because I wrote it out here. I wrote it all out to make sure I got every step. So he said, let's give practical example, right? So you could use the wallet and the table. I didn't want to mess anyone up, because the wallet and the table can be confusing because they're human-made artifacts, which I know throws some of us for a loop and is continuing to be an interesting topic of discussion and gets brought up in questions all the time. So we could use, for the same price, we could use a frog and a giraffe for the same price. So choose if you're a wallet and a table person or a frog and a giraffe person. You can follow either.
Your wallet, the giraffe's more expensive.
You could do wallet and giraffe. Giraffe made of wallet, giraffe skin wallet. Either way. So here's the subtlety, right? The subtlety is like this. The first chapter of Shaar HaYichud v'Emunah, the first chapter of Tanya, we say that a frog and a giraffe are two different creations that God creates in two different ways. There's a word in Lashon HaKodesh, there's a word God speaks to create a frog. There's a different word he speaks to create a giraffe, right, in the creation of the universe, which is all done through speech. There's a different word, right? So he relates to these two things, it would seem, differently. Right? He knows these two things differently. And this can be extrapolated to any difference in the physical universe, right? The giraffe and the frog are different colors. They exist in different places. They change over time, right? There's different things. They're in different locations constantly. There's different composition, different DNA, anything you want, right? And it's not just the frog and the giraffe. It's really everything we're talking about. But let's focus on the frog and the giraffe. So God knows the frog and the giraffe differently. Now, the question is, does this constitute a change in his knowledge, right? Does this constitute a change? Don't think of change in terms of time. right? The truth is that even having two different knowledges of two different things would really constitute a change in his knowledge as we're describing it, right? Which was really the explanation of what I said before, that it's not just he's standing outside of time and with three different knowledges of the before, the middle, and the after, right? Different knowledges, we have to break out of our time-based thinking for a moment here, right? When we say change in his knowledge, right? What is that? What do I mean? Let's go back. I want to clarify first, so we all grasp this idea properly. When we say change in his knowledge, right? God, before he creates the universe, knows everything. After he creates the universe, he knows everything. But now, apparently, right? There's two different creations. The only thing that's in this universe is a frog and a giraffe. There's now two different things. He has two different knowledges even if they don't move, even if it's a static universe, even if the frog and the giraffe are frozen forever in time. There's no time. There's only a frog and a giraffe, right? There's still two different knowledges because, right, he doesn't know two things from the outside like a human being knows a frog and a giraffe. Oh, I see two animals. My knowledge doesn't change. I stare at them all day and my knowledge doesn't change. God knows the frog and the giraffe as a constant act of creating them, each one with a different word that he is speaking. In other words, God is the innermost truth of these two things and knows them from the inside, not from the outside. That's the whole point of Shaar HaYichud ve'emunah. That's the whole point of the 6.5 chapters. The whole point of the 6.5 chapters is not that the frog and a giraffe are nothing before God. That we know before we learn Chassidus. Obviously a frog and a giraffe are nothing before God. Why would you even ask the question, right? The point is not that they're nothing. The point is that he is intimately involved in constantly creating them, and yet they are still nothing. Right? They are nothing before God. They are nothing before his act of creating them. It's a statement of closeness, not a statement of distance. Right? We're not saying God is so far above the frog and the giraffe that the frog and giraffe are nothing. You don't need Chassidus for that. You don't even need the Alter Rebbe for that. You don't need anything we've said to come to that conclusion in this class. Right? You can know that from some basic common sense. That's what God is by definition.
It's all internal.
What we are saying is that God, the frog and the giraffe are godly. They are expressions of a godly truth. They're the divine light. He is constantly speaking them into existence. He is more intimately involved in the frog and the giraffe than any botanist has ever been or will ever be. Any zoologist, pardon me, has been or will ever be. Right? He is intimately involved in the creation. God knows frogs and giraffes better than the whole human race will ever know frogs and giraffes. Yeah? This specific one, not just the whole species. He knows this specific frog and this specific giraffe, right? He has names for them. We don't know their name. He has names for them. That's what makes them individual beings, right? Is he's constantly speaking their names. So God has apparently two different knowledges. He has a knowledge of the frog, and he has a knowledge of the giraffe, the most intimate and profound knowledge. There's before they're created, and now he is constantly involved in knowing them at their very deepest essence. And he has two different knowledges. He knows two different things, right? Comes the Alter Rebbe and he explains as follows. God doesn't change. God has no different knowledges. Why? Why? Let's run through it in order. What's the difference between a frog and a giraffe? They have different natures. They'll have a different location. They'll take up time and space in unique ways. They won't be in the same space at the same time, right? There's all these differences between them. Different colors, different sounds, many different aspects to frog and giraffe, different size. What are these things caused by? We ask the student who has learned 6.5 chapters of Shaar HaYichud ve'emunah, what are the differences caused by? They're caused by the different letters that God uses to speak them into existence, right? What are the different letters that he speaks them into existence, as we learned in chapters 4, 5, and 6. What are the different letters that speak them into existence? They're different tzimtzumim, right? Different contractions, different limitations in the light as part of the act of creation, right? That's what constitute the letters of the divine speech. So there's different tzimtzumim. His divine light is contracted differently. That gives these two things different natures. Right? So far, it still seems to be two different acts, right? He contracts his light in one way to create this thing. He contracts his light in a different way to create that thing, right? Where do the different letters come from? Where does speech come from? Speech comes from, surprisingly, the mouth, right? The mouth is Malchus, God's kingship, the source of God's speech. This divine trait of Malchus is where the different letters come from. So fine, this Malchus clearly has, this divine trait clearly makes room for two different types of knowledge. It has a frog knowledge. It speaks the frog into existence, right? And it has, or let's not call it knowledge, because it's Malchus. I don't want to confuse spheres here. So let's call it he has two different things that it says. It says a frog thing, and it says a giraffe thing. So that's where, sorry?
Two different elements of his knowledge.
No, he's speaking two different things into existence constantly. So those two things are relevant to his Malchus. Yeah, so they're subsets, but they're two different subsets.
I agree, yeah.
Okay, so that's the problem. So
Malchus is, in the Siddur,
yeah.
is referred to as she.
Yes.
And so now, which means to, and I asked the rabbi this, he said that because Malchus is to receive.
Yeah.
Okay, but what you're saying is to extol.
Yes, to receive and to give out. It's a good question. It's totally unrelated to what we're doing now, but it's a fair question. Malchus is both. Malchus is both. It's a whole thing. It has a whole ascending and descending fashion. It ascends to receive. It descends to give out. It's a whole thing. Speech is the same. Speech, even though we consider speech giving out, speech receives from the mind in a whole different process. Speech receives from knowledge. It receives from thought, and Kabbalistically speaking, so it's the same, a similar idea. If Malchus didn't receive from something else, it would have nothing of its own, which is what makes Malchus special. It's a whole Kabbalistic thing. So I think let me, if you'll forgive me, let me just finish what I was going to say here. 1 second. So these changes in the nature of the frog and the giraffe derive from his Malchus. They derive from his kingship, right? What is Malchus? What is Malchus? What is his kingship? As we learned at the beginning of chapter 7, his kingship, the mouth, the source of these different divine words that create different realities for him to know, that create different realities that he will now know when he creates the universe. What is Malchus? Malchus is itself absolutely inconsequential to God. It itself is a ray of the sun in the sun. It has no reality outside of God whatsoever. Therefore, before God creates a frog and a giraffe, there's just God. After he creates a frog and a giraffe, he has two knowledges in some sense. He knows a frog and he knows a giraffe, but what are these two knowledges? These two knowledges are the same knowledge, which is the knowledge of himself. These things, the differences amount to nothing. Right? Kabbalistically speaking, you say the same about all differences contained within time and space. Different creations that change over time, creations that change their spatial location. It's all the same. It all comes from Malchus. Malchus itself is inconsequential. Therefore, because he does not change, because when he creates the universe, this constitutes no change to him, the source of the whole universe is itself absolutely inconsequential to him. Therefore, when he knows the universe that has now been created, what does he know? Exactly what he knew before. Right? There is nothing new to know. All the differences come from Malchus. Every difference, all differences in time and space and sensation and quality, and all the differences between things that we're familiar with in our world, all come from Malchus. And Malchus itself, the divine trait of kingship, is to him totally inconsequential. So exactly like a ray of the sun in the sun. So just as he knew himself, just as the sun knows itself before there is a ray within it, so too it knows itself after there is a ray within it. Right? Just as God knows himself before he creates the universe, so too he knows himself after he creates the universe. And Malchus doesn't add anything. And you might think, well, maybe Malchus doesn't add, but the speech which leaves him, right? Speeches in human beings leaves the person. You would think the things that he is speaking add to him. The first 6 chapters, right? The first 6 chapters of Tanya are all about how the speech itself is nothing but the source of the speech, right? The speech actually doesn't leave Malchus, just like the ray of the sun never leaves the sun. That's the whole metaphor, right? The ray of the sun never leaves the sun. The speech never leaves Malchus. So the speech is like a ray within Malchus. Malchus is like a ray within God as he is unchanging and infinite. Right? Therefore, neither the source of the world nor the act of creating it by speaking it into existence imposes or creates a change in his knowledge. There is nothing to know that wasn't there before. That's the point. There is... Yeah, sorry?
Doesn't make total sense.
Which part doesn't make sense?
Makes you want to be
Probably
atheist.
all of it, because why would he have gone and destroyed universes then?
What? Beina elam is a machrivan. It's a whole different idea. You're saying, why does he create the universe if the whole thing is inconsequential anyway, right? We're operating on the opposite end of the table, right? The whole of Chassidus, you could if you wanted, if you were being cute, you could construe the whole of Chassidus as a debate over why the universe should be here or shouldn't be here, right? Right now we're arguing very powerfully that it shouldn't be here. I assure you, there's other places where I explain exactly why it is here, why it's important, what the relevance of it is. That's not our purpose here. Remember, taking a step back, what's the entire point of Shaar HaYichud v'Emunah? What's the entire point of this part of Tanya that we are 7.5 chapters into? The entire point is, what do I think about to cause a love of God in my heart? Right? And the answer is, to love God, you have to know God. And you say, I don't know God. The answer is, on the contrary, everything that you know is knowing God, if you understand it, right? Everything that you know is knowing God if you understand what that means, right? And you understand that everything that you know is actually not worth knowing, because all it is a facade over a much deeper reality, which is Him. And when you see next to each other the absolute nothingness of living a life of choosing this universe, right? Of choosing things in this world which to love, or you can choose a life of choosing God, who is the only true reality that's here, right? The choice becomes obvious, and that causes a love of God in the heart. That's the whole point of learning this part of Tanya. The whole point of learning this part of Tanya is not to learn necessarily, although we will mention them, why to do mitzvahs, right? Which is the other end of the scale. Why does the universe exist, right? What actually is it here for? In other words, okay, I love God, I understand He's the only reality, so what's with the rest of my life? Why is the rest of this here? Why does the table appear to exist and the wallet appear to exist and all of these things appear to exist? It's a different question, right? Almost a different book. Not really, but almost, right? There's what's called in Hebrew the ratzoi v'shuv, right? There's the approaching, and then there's the returning, which the idea is that you study Shaar HaYichud v'Emunah. The practical example of ratzoi v'shuv in the life of a student of Chassidus is that you study Shaar HaYichud v'Emunah, you become passionate about God, you decide that all that you want to do is love God, and then you turn to God and to ask Him, how can I love you? And God tells you, get away from me, go down into the world and wrap tefillin. Right? That's Ratzoi, I approach Him, and Shuv, I return. Right? The greater my love for God, the more I realize that God doesn't want me to be next to Him, loving Him. He wants me to be here in the universe, making the universe a dwelling place for God. And it's a cycle. And then, the more I'm in the universe, making it a dwelling place for God, the more I feel that I'm getting further and further away from Him. So I stop doing that, and I move towards Him, emotionally speaking. I want to be close to You. Please don't make me go down there. Please don't make me wrap tefillin and put on tzitzis and eat food. This is awful. All I want to do is love God, and then God tells you, I want you to go and eat and wrap tefillin and put on tzitzis, right? And that's life. That's what it means in Avodah, in the service of God. There's a famous story told by Chassidim. I believe Reb Mendel Futterfass used to like telling the story. I believe it's attributed as one of his favorites, that the two souls meet each other, right? One's on the way up from this world, the person that's just passed away, and one's on the way down to be born, right? They meet in the middle. Two souls meet each other. And the one coming down says, he's a bit afraid. He says, what's it like? What's it like down there? And the soul that's going up says, have you heard of tzitzis? And the soul that's coming down says, tzitzis, have I heard of it? The angels scream about it. There's fireworks. There's a whole, you can't believe how great tzitzis are. Tzitzis is the greatest thing that's ever existed. Every day, ranks of infinite angels trumpet when one person puts on tzitzis, never mind the entire Jewish people. Tzitzis is amazing. And so the soul that's coming up from the world says, well, tzitzis, down there, you can get tzitzis 5 kopecks, right? 5 cents you can buy a pair of tzitzis. And the soul that's going down says, forget you, I'm going down to the world. And he throws himself down at great speed. And the soul that's going up calls after him. He says, wait, I didn't get a chance to tell you what you have to do to earn the 5 kopecks. Right? That's the famous Chassidic story. And on that note, God willing, we'll continue next week.
Cool.